From the very start, the Luftwaffe was an exceptional force. In the 1930s, most of the world's other air forces were little more than appendages on the fringes of society. These small forces consumed a part of meager defense budgets and occasionally gave public displays that seemed unrelated to everyday life. Whereas Hitler's Luftwaffe, along with the Wehrmacht, represented the very foundation on which the international aspirations of the Führer lay. Unlike other air forces, which ostensibly existed for defense, the true purpose behind the Luftwaffe was to attack. The world first saw a glimpse of the Luftwaffe in action during the Spanish Civil War. At first, it did not need to attack. Its very presence, grossly and successfully magnified by the German propaganda machine, when in reality its power was small, served to deter all opposition by much stronger nations. None of them intervened when Hitler marched his goose-stepping legions into the Saar, the Rhineland, Sudetenland, Austria, and finally the whole of Czechoslovakia. The crunch came in August 1939. Having failed to act when Germany was relatively weak, France and Britain finally pledged their support for Poland. By this time, however, the Luftwaffe had grown sufficiently in strength, and Hitler gave the orders to attack Poland. The Luftwaffe spearheading the attack. In a famed order of the day, Hermann Göring, a veteran pilot of the First World War and architect of the Luftwaffe, said, "Born of the spirit of the German airmen of World War I, inspired by its faith in our Führer and Commander-in-Chief, thus stands the German Air Force today, ready to carry out every command of the Führer with lightning speed and undreamed of might." When Warsaw surrendered on the 27th of September 1939, the success of the lightning German campaign had been overwhelming, even to the Germans. The contribution of the Luftwaffe had been outstanding, and credence was given to even the wildest claims concerning the potency of German air power. Later, Albert Kesselring, the infamous German air marshal, wrote, "Beyond all other military arms, the Luftwaffe, by virtue of its mobility in space, accomplished tasks which in former times would have been inconceivable." The Polish campaign was the touchstone of the potentialities of the Luftwaffe and an apprenticeship of special significance. In this campaign, the Luftwaffe learned many lessons which allowed it to prepare itself for the most strenuous and decisive clashes of arms to come. The invasion of Denmark and Norway also called for considerable support from the Luftwaffe. In addition to its role of tactical and strategical support, the Luftwaffe was also required to provide a large transport force to airlift paratroopers, infantry, supplies, and fuel. During the battle for France, the Luftwaffe offered massive and overwhelming support on an unprecedented scale to the ground forces of the Wehrmacht. The bomber units on this campaign consisted of some 1,120 aircraft. The single-engine fighter units amounted to 860 aircraft. The twin-engine fighter force deployed 355 aircraft, whilst a further 640 aircraft operated within the maritime realm. In support, there were a further 500-plus aircraft for supply and paratroop operations. Almost 3,500 aircraft in all. There were large-scale attacks on the Dutch and Belgian air forces. Transport and rail centers were knocked out. Airborne landings took place throughout Belgium and Holland. Ahead of the invasion force, reconnaissance aircraft of the Luftwaffe took note of enemy positions, showing their movements and weak points. The Stuka dive bombers of the Luftwaffe inflicted a paralysis on the French and British armies that was a revelation to even the Germans themselves. They were operating within complete air superiority, and thus the legend of the Stuka continued to flourish. Such was the numerical and technical superiority over the RAF and Armée de l'Air that the Allied fighters were never in a position to interfere seriously with the Luftwaffe's tactical operations. It wasn't until Dunkirk that the Messerschmitts first encountered the RAF Spitfires, flown by resolute and skillful pilots. In combat against this nimble fighter, the German pilots found for the first time that their own aircraft could be outturned and outclimbed, and for the first time, they were forced to fly to the limits of their performance. This was perhaps the first indication that the Luftwaffe was not invincible. Losses were high. With the fighters being engaged in dogfights, the bombers were flying without support and suffered considerably as a consequence, as did the Stukas. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had met an opponent of equal fighting capabilities in the air and, as a consequence, prevented the Dunkirk evacuation. Following the fall of France, the Luftwaffe was withdrawn for a refit in expectation of the next phase of the war in the West, the invasion of the British Isles. As yet, however, the Luftwaffe had only a foretaste of effective and determined fighter opposition. But basking in the realms of victory, neither Goering nor his senior commanders had yet recognized its implications. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, the task of the Luftwaffe was twofold. One, they were to eliminate the Royal Air Force both as a fighting force and also as a ground organization. And two, they were to strangle the supply of Great Britain by destroying its ports and shipping. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe bomber forces began to show themselves over the English Channel, attacking ports, shipping, and coastal airfields. At the same time, large formations of Me-109s began to appear over southern England at high altitude in an attempt to draw the RAF fighters into combat. At first, the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes obliged. Suffering tactical disadvantage while climbing for altitude, they were soon bounced by the Messerschmitts and suffered accordingly. But the lessons were soon learned, and the RAF changed their formation tactics. The tables were quickly turned as a result. The losses sustained by the Luftwaffe during the period of July and August had been bearable, but it was clear that the RAF was an effective fighting force and was not suffering sufficiently heavy damage as to affect their capability. It now became necessary for the Luftwaffe's bombers to try and penetrate further inland in order to destroy a higher percentage of RAF fighters on the ground. Such was the ferocity of the RAF fighter pilots that 3 times the number of escorting fighters over the figures originally estimated were found to be needed for adequate support for the bomber formations. In addition, the long-range fighters needed for such support were hopelessly outclassed by the Spitfires and Hurricanes in fighter versus fighter combat. By the 8th of August, attacks by the Luftwaffe had intensified. On one day alone, the 15th of August, no fewer than 1,786 sorties were put up by the Luftwaffe. During the following week, the pace and strength of the campaign was kept up, the Luftwaffe losing over 500 aircraft as a result, although the British too had heavy losses, with over 200 aircraft lost. The time for establishing air superiority over Britain was running out for the Luftwaffe, and its achievement now called for desperate measures. The effort was laid on knocking out the RAF on the ground, with the emphasis on those aircraft deployed around London. The fierce fighting that ensued was unprecedented, and losses were high on both sides. For the RAF, it was reaching crisis point, with its squadrons of experienced yet battle-weary pilots bearing the major share. Fresh units lacking combat experience were soon decimated. Hitler, however, in a fit of madness, following a solitary raid by RAF bombers on Berlin, made a huge mistake. Advised by Goering that the RAF was finally exhausted and no longer a threat, Hitler turned his bombers on the cities, and in particular, London. It was a fatal blunder on his part. From then on, the RAF Fighter Command was able to operate in the air and on the ground with an impunity not previously experienced. On the afternoon of the 7th of September, the Luftwaffe flew 372 bomber and 642 fighter sorties against targets in East London, starting large fires and causing considerable damage. That night, a further 255 bomber sorties were directed to the same area. These raids were kept up for the next few days, but Luftwaffe losses were beginning to mount on a scale that far exceeded the results achieved. Recrimination amongst the fighter and bomber arms followed, each sharply criticizing the other for its apparent shortcomings. By the 15th of September, it was obvious that the goal of air superiority was as far away as ever. 2 days later, Hitler abandoned Operation Sea Lion. The Battle of Britain had been a failure for the Luftwaffe. Yet in just over 1 year, the Luftwaffe had successfully swarmed over the whole of Western Europe and, save for the stubborn British, had conquered all in its path. History had known nothing like it. Germany's eyes now turned to the Soviet Union, the ultimate goal. Italy's prevarications in North Africa and the Mediterranean, however, forced German commitment in this theater before any major assault could be made in the east. Although the Luftwaffe was well equipped for additional commitments in the Balkans, the Mediterranean and North Africa throughout the spring of 1941, and was to achieve brilliant victories in the course of its campaigns, its involvement on 2 fronts came at a time when all effort should have been made to conserve its strength. When, finally, the main weight of the Luftwaffe was turned against the Soviet Union in June 1941, a considerable proportion of its strength had been already diverted elsewhere. Germany's conquests had been resumed in 1941 with smashing blows to the southeast through the Balkans, Crete, and into North Africa. In June 1941, the might of the Luftwaffe thundered to the east, deep into the Soviet Union. They had moved some 2,770 frontline aircraft to the east from France and the Mediterranean. This amounted to 65% of the total Luftwaffe first-line inventory. On the morning of the 22nd of June, the Luftwaffe unleashed its mighty force. The forward Soviet air bases came under heavy attacks by the Ju-88s and He-111s. Low-level strikes were made by Bf-110s and bomb-carrying 109s. The few Soviet fighters that did get airborne were mostly dispatched with relative ease. On this one day alone, the Luftwaffe achieved a staggering success. For the loss of a mere 32 of its own aircraft, the Luftwaffe destroyed 1,811 Soviet aircraft, all but 322 of those being destroyed on the ground. By the end of September, Leningrad came under siege, and 665,000 Russian troops had been either killed or captured, nearly one-third of the entire strength of the Soviet armies. Throughout the preceding months since June, the Luftwaffe had retained almost total air superiority. Although the figures may have been undoubtedly exaggerated, the Soviet losses were enormous. Between the 22nd of June and the 13th of July alone, the Luftwaffe had claimed 4,628 Soviet aircraft lost. The fact that the air fighting over the Soviet Union was considered easy is a matter of considerable conjecture. This is particularly apparent when the massive individual scores of the German fighter aces operating in the Soviet Union are compared with those fighting on the Channel Front, or over Germany, or in the Mediterranean. Some aces were scoring as many as 12 kills a day, with scores climbing well over 100, 200, and even 300. Yet elsewhere, such figures were impossible. There is no doubt, however, that for the first 2 years, the German pilots were masters of the Soviet skies. And it was to remain that way until 1943, when they were to come up against a foe who could match them on equal terms. The reasons for the success of those aces were many, but the main ones were that the Messerschmitt 109 was far superior to any Soviet fighter of the day, as was the later Focke-Wulf 190. The German fighter airfields were much closer to the front line, and therefore the area of operations, and the German pilots were tactically superior to their Russian opponents. By 1942, however, things began to change. The Luftwaffe had been weakened by the redeployment of some of its force to Sicily in the Mediterranean. Then came winter. Throughout the following months, the situation worsened. The Soviet armies were on the attack, and with them came new aircraft, new types, which would alter the course of the war in the East. With the reversal at Stalingrad by November, which ultimately led to the German defeat, the situation became critical for the Luftwaffe. The combat units became drawn further and further away from their forward bases. The Soviet pilots were fresh, and the new aircraft types were making their mark. The reverses suffered at Stalingrad and at El Alamein in North Africa had finally disposed of any German illusions of a swift victory. In fact, some had already considered the war lost when the Soviet Union was invaded. No country could sustain a war on two fronts. For the majority, however, the belief was that those defeats indicated that the final result would not take months, but years to achieve. For the Luftwaffe, it was a state of crisis. They had been prepared for a short war. Now, with the Soviet army on the offensive, when to all intents and purposes its recent losses should have ensured its virtual defeat, and with Germany facing two closing battlefronts in Tunisia, and with the day and night bombing raids over Germany, the Luftwaffe was stretched far beyond its initial limits. The measurement of battle capability of any military force is its morale, coupled with its numerical strength. Whilst there was no cause for concern over the fighting spirit of the Luftwaffe's airmen, there most certainly was for the service's diminishing strength, both in manpower and material. By December of 1942, the Luftwaffe's frontline complement of aircraft had fallen from 4,300 to 3,600 aircraft, the lowest since 1939. In manpower, the Luftwaffe had grown from 600,000 at the beginning of the war to 1,100,000 men, but the diversion of manpower for ground fighting had started to erode this figure. Coupled with this manpower drain was the problem of aircrew training. As with the production of new aircraft, this had been gauged upon the assumption of a short war. The Battle of Britain and the Soviet campaign had badly eaten into the body of fully trained aircrew, and the reservoir of older, experienced pilots was all but exhausted, with the flow no longer sufficient to replace losses. The result was the need to bring in less experienced aircrew to the front line. The expectation of a short war had also manifested itself in Germany's policies in aircraft production and aircraft development. During the first 2 years of the war, no less than 16 different aircraft production programs were started. None of them lasted longer than 6 to 8 weeks before being shelved in place of another new program. The problem was multiplied when the Germans learnt that the combined Anglo-American air forces were estimating to be capable of fielding 20,000 bombers by the end of 1943. Aircraft development in Germany had proceeded swiftly on jet engines, rockets, guided missiles, new guns, and many new aircraft, which ranged across Asia to the Japanese and on test flights as far as New York. Yet, in fact, these new weapons of the Luftwaffe in the main proved nothing more than side issues that had no effect on the course of the war. By the end of 1942, production had risen to 1,650 a month, and with the need for the Luftwaffe to go on the defensive, 1,000 of these were fighters. The plan was to increase this figure to 2,000 fighters a month, and even later to 3,000. At first, the massive scale of the impending Allied bombing offensive had not been realized. Thus, the centers of aircraft production had been mistakenly placed within bombing range of the Allied forces. As a result, many of them were wiped out. However, although the factories still managed to turn out high quantities, there remained the problem of quality. Despite the undoubted brilliance of the German aircraft designers, the few aircraft types earmarked for the re-equipment of the Luftwaffe in place of the older types had failed to come up to standard. Of these, some failed to reach operational requirements, whilst others never left the research establishments. Amazingly, no priority whatsoever had been given to the jet-engined Me-262. And whilst these remarkably innovative fighters were allowed to remain the playthings of the aircraft industry and test centres, the Luftwaffe was forced to soldier on with modified variants of the already established older types. The early months of 1943 were, therefore, a period of crisis in Luftwaffe resources and manpower. In the Soviet Union, the last great Wehrmacht offensives in the Ukraine and Caucasus had foundered at Stalingrad, and now the Russians were gathering strength for their summer campaigns. In North Africa, the situation was once again one of impending defeat, and now there was the third commitment of defending Germany and the occupied territories against Anglo-American bombing. For Hitler, the first necessity was to bring the Russian advance to a halt, and by reason of this, the Soviet Union was to have the first claim on the Luftwaffe. German war machinery had managed to increase the strength of the Luftwaffe to over 6,000 frontline aircraft by the June of 1943, a total never again to be achieved throughout the rest of the war. 2,500 of these were in the Soviet Union. Over 1,000 were to support the planned German offensive Operation Citadel, the battle for Kursk. During the opening phases of the battle, the Luftwaffe flew over 3,000 sorties a day, with each serviceable fighter flying as many as 5 or 6 missions. This effort decreased by 50% within the next week, and then fell again to less than 1,000 a day for the remainder of the battle. In total, they flew 37,421 sorties, destroying 1,735 Soviet aircraft for a loss of only 64 of their own. They destroyed a further 1,100 tanks and 1,300 vehicles. And yet, whilst these impressive figures applied to the Battle of Kursk salient, elsewhere on the Eastern Front, the situation gave cause for concern. Luftwaffe losses were growing rapidly. In June, they lost 487. This rose in July to 911, followed by a further 785 losses in August. Air superiority in the east was switching to the Soviet Air Force. For the Luftwaffe, this overall failure was to have widespread repercussions. They were now on the defense. In Germany, the situation was worsening. Despite the effective German night fighter force with its network of radar and tracking stations, the Allied bombing campaign was wreaking havoc on the cities, industrial centers, and transport networks. By 1944, the net had begun to close on Germany. The perimeters of the Third Reich was steadily shrinking. The Luftwaffe, its strength now drastically depleted, was hastily preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion. On the first day of the invasion, some indication of the disparity between the Luftwaffe and the Allied air forces can be gauged from the fact that by comparison with the 100 fighter and 175 bomber sorties mounted by the Luftwaffe, no fewer than 14,674 were flown by the Allies. On the beachheads themselves, the Luftwaffe was noteworthy for its virtual absence. Although they were slow to respond, the Luftwaffe did rush over 1,000 fighters to the area within a week, thus stiffening the opposition. By the end of June 1944, Allied air superiority was such that most Luftwaffe units were suffering from depleted strength and low serviceability. With the transport networks under constant attack, ferrying of new aircraft to the front line was virtually impossible. By September 1944, the worsening situation had forced a general reorganization of the command structure within the Luftwaffe. The majority of its remaining force was committed to the defense of the Reich, and in particular the remaining oil installations, for fuel was beginning to run out. In all, 70% of the Luftwaffe's total strength was earmarked for the defense of the oil industry. For Allied pilots and aircrews, nurtured by the press that stated on every occasion that the Luftwaffe was a beaten force as demonstrated by its absence over the Normandy landings, this apparent resurgence in strength came as a grim reminder of the resilience of the Luftwaffe so often displayed in the past. True, many of the Luftwaffe's pilots in 1944 were not of the same caliber as those of 1940, but they still displayed an enthusiasm and aggressive spirit and tenacity, plus a determination comparable with that of the RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain. Within the Luftwaffe at this time, only a tiny minority of pilots had any more than 6 months operational experience. A small minority had 3 months or so, whilst the majority had less than 3 weeks. With little time, the training schools had emphasized the technicalities of flying to the detriment of gunnery and tactics. This was revealed in all the fatal mistakes of the inexperienced pilot in combat, absurdly inadequate air search and preoccupation with flying in formation, and an inability to fly the aircraft to its limits. The tendency to forget to jettison the drop tank or arm the weapons when joining combat, and finally, an inability to break off combat and escape when warranted by a tactical situation. Equipment was good and the fighters were still available in sufficient quantity, but most of the pilots lacked the vital element of quality. Fighter operations against the Allies soon took their toll. The support of the Ardennes offensive was the last real claim of glory for the Luftwaffe, flying over 600 sorties a day in this last-ditched attempt to drive back the Allies. The winter of 1944-45 gave the Luftwaffe a badly needed respite, time to regroup and rearm. On the 1st of January, some 900 aircraft were being readied in preparation for the Luftwaffe's last desperate gamble, a low-level surprise attack on the Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. Although the attack did achieve complete surprise, results were poor. In the chaos of a now disorganized command, many of the fighters were shot down by their own ground flak. Although they did damage or destroy over 200 Allied aircraft, They lost 170 of their own in the process. They still held on in the Soviet Union, but in the West, the fuel situation was now desperate, and that, coupled with Allied air attacks on German airfields, meant that the Luftwaffe's capacity for operations was reduced further still. British and American aircraft were now roaming the skies over Germany almost at will. Despite its initial overwhelming might, the Luftwaffe had suffered too many severe blows. As early as the Battle of Britain, the force had been defeated in a major objective. At Stalingrad, during the bitter winter of 1942-43, it failed again in what was an equally impossible task, leaving the remains of von Paulus's Sixth Army to surrender. In Germany, city after city had been laid waste by the RAF's night bombers, while the US AAF's bombers had mounted increasingly damaging attacks by day. Before the war, Goering had said, "If any enemy bomber penetrates to Germany, my name is no longer Hermann Goering. You can call me Maya." On the 21st of April 1945, the leader of the Luftwaffe drove out of Berlin for the last time, heading south, without any plans and with little left at his disposal to command. On the way, he had to take cover in an air raid shelter. "Let me introduce myself," he said. "My name is Meyer." Without any real direction, the force now consisted of small pockets. Of those few units which were still operational and still had fuel, sporadic attacks and sorties were mounted against the Allied bridgeheads. But in general, effective opposition virtually ceased in the west. In the east, even though they had managed to fly as many as 1,000 sorties a day in April, by the end of the month, this successively waned as the Russians overran the airfields one by one. Berlin fell on the 2nd of May. And finally, on the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. For Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, who had repeatedly undermined his own pilots and constantly blamed them for Germany's ill fortunes, his fate was sealed. He had led the German people to believe that his pilots were responsible for the catastrophe they were living through. This legend took root for many years amongst the German people, and yet history has proved that this blame lies elsewhere and confirms the brave efforts of the fighter pilots. In truth, the Luftwaffe was inevitably crushed by overwhelming Allied air power. Unquenchable courage, devotion to the defense of their country's civilians, and unmatched overall combat skills were of no ultimate avail. The pilots of the Luftwaffe could not win, yet they fought to the final hour in an unforgettable combat saga. They lived by the traditional code of soldiers, and there should be no shame or dishonor as their conduct in wartime remains untarnished. As one German ace wrote to his British counterpart, "It is reassuring for both parties when, after combat, the visors are opened and the faces of real decent men among the enemy peer out of the helmet."